Agenda for today. We will first be hearing from each of our panelists. While we are listening, please drop any questions you have in the chat or DM them to Heather, Akron DSA's other co-chair. We will have some time for questions after each panelist speaks. After all panelists have spoken, we will have our Q&A portion of the town hall. If you have questions that were not answered yet, it will be answered during this time. If your question is for a specific panelist, please add this to your question, or not if it is open to anyone on the panel to answer.
What the hell?
After our Q&A, we will have our closing and we'll open the floor to comments and building connections. I am happy to welcome our first panelist and speaker, Cara Hall. Cara is currently the co-chair of Las Vegas DSA, a member of the Growth and Development Committee working specifically on recruitment, and is on the steering committee of the Socialist Feminist National Working Group. Before she was in DSA, Cara did a lot of community organizing, focusing specifically on women's issues, such as reproductive justice and sexual violence. She also holds a BA in Women's Studies from UNLV. Cara will be speaking about intersectionality today. Thank you for being here, Cara.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. All right, well, as Bryn said, my name is Cara, she, her. I'm currently the co-chair of Las Vegas DSA. Yeah, so, you know, one thing that I really wanted to kind of drive home was the intersectionality piece of doing like socialist feminist work, especially in like a socialist space. I think it's really important, and I think it's kind of the like backbone or like foundation of all the other work we do. In 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, which is the idea that multiple oppressions reinforce each other to create new categories of suffering. Before that, though, in 1977, the Combahee River Collective, a group of Black feminists, put out a statement in which they described the meaning of intersectionality. If anybody has time, like you can look up probably the Combahee River Collective statement online. It's only a few pages and it's like a phenomenal read. The Combahee River Collective described oppressions as interlocking or happening simultaneously. So in other words, Black women could not quantify oppression in only terms of sexism or racism or homophobia and say like Black lesbians. Their oppression was never based on a single category, but the merging of those different identities. The intersecting factors of race, gender, and class meant that Black women were overrepresented in the ranks of the poor and the working class. It's also why Black trans women and Indigenous women remain the most vulnerable in our society. They believed it was not only crucial to understand the particular experiences of Black women as compared to white women or Black men, but it also created entry points for them to engage in politics. This was a critical aspect of the Combahee River Collective's political intervention in the women's movement. One could not expect Black women to be wholly active in political movements that neither represented them nor advanced their interests. So I feel like when I hear stuff like that too, like, it goes a lot to what we do today, what the work we do in DSA and all that kind of stuff. Because, right, like if we're not representing all the different groups and all different people of the working class, then we're not going to be an organization that people are going to feel comfortable organizing in. So we need to make sure that the work we do is intersectional. Can people hear me? There's like a car wash. Okay. I want to ask a question, and people can put answers like in the chat. When we think of women's issues, what type of issues come to mind? So if people want to drop like women's issue, you know, what you would work on in a social fem committee, anything else, like what are women's issues when we talk about like feminist issues or anything like that? Right, pay equity, reproductive justice, yep, wage gap, reproductive health, a lot of that, abortion, child care, menstrual products, period poverty. Domestic violence. Good, good. Yeah, so these are all what like most people think of, right? This is what we think of when we do that. Organizations that work primarily on just women's issues, right? This is the kind of stuff that they do. But how about things like unaffordable housing, poverty wages, inadequate healthcare, border policing, climate change? Aren't these actually like the biggest issues that affect women all across our globe? In fact, these things affect more women than even most of those things that are named, but we don't think of them as women's issues, right? So like, it's important that, you know, those kind of things get brought together, because we can't just work on one thing for one type of person, because we won't be an organization that really is able to be representative. The feminism that you often see in the US is called equal opportunity domination, or what we really refer to as like liberal feminism. Does anybody know what that means, or can like give me an example of what like liberal feminism would be? Anybody?
Supporting Hillary Clinton, so we have a lady president.
Hillary Clinton is a great example, just in general, right? Girl boss. You know, Kamala Harris, we're supposed to be pumped, right? We just elected this Black woman to be vice president of the United States. This is great, right? So that's what liberal feminism is. And there's a book, Feminism for the 99%. It's very good. It's very small. I read it in like 2 hours. The authors talk about this choice we have. Our current society asks ordinary people, in the name of feminism, to be grateful that it is a woman and not a man who is their boss, a woman that's not a man who is their vice president, which also becomes like, right, that it's a woman who busts their union, or a woman who orders drones to kill overseas, a woman who locks kids in cages, right? So like, this is what we're supposed to be excited about, right? You know, like, instead of getting rid of prisons, let's just make prisons half owned by women, or, you know, like, these are supposed to be solutions to our problem. That's like liberal feminism. But like, we believe as socialists, right, we can envision something better than this. So that's why it's imperative that the type of feminism we strive for is actually intersectional. It must be a feminism that is both anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Otherwise, we're stuck with things like liberal feminism. Instead, if we make sure our work is intersectional, we can reimagine gender justice in its anti-capitalist form, one that leads beyond the present crisis to an entirely new society. Yes, and thank you very much for the links, Bryn, because I did not have those prepared, and I feel like I should have. That's about all I really wanted to kind of say. I know that Blanca is going to be talking about some international stuff. Jalen's going to be talking about, you know, sex workers, pay, you know, labor, kind of what that looks like. And it's just like, while we do this work, we want to make sure that, right, it's for all people and all of our workers, and that, so that was always at like kind of the heart of it, which is why it's important that, you know, we care about women internationally, right? Our country isn't designed for that. We're not even supposed to care about other countries, right? It's just like America first for everything. You know, Jalen's going to talk about some really interesting things, I believe, that will kind of show the difference in just how like women are treated and things like that. So I just always believe that this is kind of the foundation of the work that we need to do, and kind of those building blocks to make sure that like the work we do. So when you have a socialist feminist committee, or you're doing socialist feminist work in your chapter, it's great and it's awesome, but you should also make sure that all your other committees are being like having like a feminist lens as well, so that when you're, you know, eco-socialism committee or something, like, should be able to address the differences for women across the globe. And when you do like Medicare for all and you're doing that stuff, like, you know, Black women experience our healthcare system very differently than say white women or other people. So it's important that it has to get built in, and it has to be below the work we do into like, you know, these committees. And I'm guilty of it. Our chapter has a bunch of different committees and things like that. But when it comes to racial justice, feminism, anti-imperialism should be at like kind of the root at all of the different things we do. So you want to make sure you're holding people really accountable to that too, in your chapter and otherwise. But okay, that's all I have. So if people have questions, or later, but.
Thank you, Cara. We will now be pulling and reading a few questions from the Zoom chat. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I can answer that. Akron DSA does not have one yet. Let's get on that. Let's do that together. Any other questions, we'd be happy to read from the chat. Okay, throughout the rest of our town hall, if you have any questions as you think of them, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be able to get to them. We will now be moving on, but before we move on, let's give a Zoom round of applause for Cara. Awesome. I am pleased to welcome our second panelist and speaker, Blanca Estevez. Blanca lives and organizes in the South, where she has been helping reunite families separated by ICE and establishing the Northwest Arkansas chapter. She was elected to DSA's National Political Committee in 2019, where she currently serves as liaison to the Mutual Aid Working Group, Personnel, and the International Committee. She is committed to a DSA with Latinx workers, which includes language justice, international organizing, developing the IC and IRWG, and fostering a better relationship between the NPC and DSA staff. Blanca will be speaking about the state of socialist feminism in Latin America. Thank you for being here, Blanca.
Great. Thanks so much, Bryn and Heather, for inviting me. Let me just try to share my screen. Is it working? Okay. I'm so sorry. I don't know. Technology is not the best for me. Okay. All right. So women in Latin America form the basis of life. She is in all the communities. She is in the villages, in the ranches, and in the quilombos, in the towns, and in the cities. So what do movements mean for Latin America? There's a study from the Update Institute. It's impossible to talk about feminist politics in the region without mentioning the Argentine movement, organized on social media, Ni Una Menos. The first march was held on June 3rd, 2015 in 80 cities across Argentina and brought together an impressive 300,000 people. From that day on, the movement became a phenomenon of about 800,000 people. Ni Una Menos, this campaign, sparked a wave of women's uprisings in Latin America. In Argentina, it led to a call to Marea Verde, a campaign for the right to legal abortion. They ended up winning. It just took a few years, but they did win. In 2018, 2 million women participated in demonstrations with green scarves, which became the symbol of the uprising. Okay. In the same year, the Argentine Chamber of Deputies approved a bill drafted by women from civil society and deputies. The project was later vetoed by the Senate, but La Marea managed to put the issue on the table and in conversations within ordinary families across the country. Then, the following year, in Mexico, hashtag No Me Cuidan, Me Violan gathered women on the streets to protest against police violence. In Brazil, the movement inspired women to organize demonstrations against the then president of the Chamber of Deputies, Eduardo Cunha, author of a project that made it difficult for women to access legal abortion. The protests escalated following the murder of councilwoman in Brazil, Marielle Franco, on March 14th, 2018. Women returned to the streets to respond to Bolsonaro's candidacy for the presidency after the message, hashtag not him. The organization of the protests and the scope of the protests are the result of women's work. The demand was not specific to the feminist agenda, but hashtag not him became the largest women's mobilization in the history of Brazil. So these examples show that when meeting in the streets to make their demands heard, women's groups realize that an efficient way to move the system is from the inside and outside. So you enter, everybody thinks that you are on the outside pushing in when you're protesting in the streets, but really it makes such a difference, the continued pressure for the people on inside too, to the point that gender parity is a reality in local legislatures in Argentina, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Mexico and Bolivia show parity in the 3 branches of government. So we continue to stay there. Gender parity becomes real. And how can I want to say I have on social media seen since 2017 when the first Women's March happened and everybody was so stoked and all the pictures were happening. People kept asking, like, why can't we have movements like in Latin America where they had just everybody out on the streets, changing the constitution of Chile to include more women, to include the socialism? Why can't we do that? And this is a real question, and I hope that everybody figures it out. But in the US, we have this, like Cara said, liberal feminism, where we don't think about how white women do hold back change. They don't realize that they are the oppressed and also the oppressor. So they're not seeing themselves as equal to us, even though we are women. We're supposed to be out there for wage gaps, all these things that really help white women more than they do us. So that's something that I think that everybody should think about. What is holding us back, and what is holding us back from acknowledging that white women are the oppressors and can be the oppressed as well? Both things can be true. And how can we be better about it? How can we stay out here? Latin American feminism is just so different. It's just constantly, and I know that everybody can go on Twitter and check out, especially the police demonstrations in Mexico. There was just a recent one where a Salvadorian woman was killed by the police, and the next day everybody came out. I mean, they were, don't throw stuff at anybody, but they were throwing stuff at like the police, and it was just in solidarity with the woman that's not even from Mexico to be there. So all to say, right now, it is different than what we would think as progress, I guess, here in the United States. Like Argentina just got the right to abortion. My motherland of El Salvador, it's illegal there. But the work that's being done by socialist feminists is making things like water stay a public resource. These things that we don't think about, that Cara said earlier, that affect women in all sectors. So I think that's all I wanted to say, is that they've achieved gender parity through the constant direct actions that they take, and they never tire. And I know that you can see through that. I mean, you can see through social media campaigns how long they stay out there for. I mean, there's like the green is associated with this, but so is the purple color. And it's women being in power in Latin America through the pandemic has also helped, because I don't want to say in power, but in positions of power has also helped, because they've been able to do, like in Venezuela, they've been able to do a better job of doing school at home than we even did here in the United States. So just making sure that there's intersectional representation on every level here would get us at least closer to where Latin America feminism is. Happy to answer any questions. Oh, I see Julie, I guess. Yeah, okay, Jill, thank you.
Hi, I guess we're having some technical difficulties. So for the remaining few minutes, I guess I will temporarily host. I'm going to introduce Jalen now. Okay. So Jalen lives and organizes in Las Vegas. As the chair of the Las Vegas DSA Socialist Feminist Committee, she collaborates with the Mutual Aid Committee on a menstrual product drive. Jalen also works for Think of Us, a nonprofit organization driving systems of change within the child welfare system. Okay, go ahead when you're ready, Jalen.
Hi, thank you so much for the intro. My name is Jalen, she, her, and thank you for having me. And so I'm going to talk about sex work and women's labor within the context of socialist feminism and abolition. Going to ask basically two fundamental questions. One is that, is sex work work? And the second is, what labor rights do sex workers or performers of sexual labor have, or what workplace protections and labor rights do we believe as socialists that they should have? So first and foremost, whenever we talk about sex work, we want to make sure that we're allowing sex workers themselves to be the source of information regarding what policies and what regulations they believe are the best fit for like that movement and acquiring the rights and liberties that they're looking for. And so it's really helpful to define sex work so that everybody understands exactly what type of labor that we are talking about. So sex work can manifest in a variety of different forms. There's street-based sex work, which is probably the most depicted in Hollywood movies or TV shows or romantic or like sexual or erotic literature. There's also brothel-based sex work. There is exotic dancing, exotic entertaining. There's pornography, camming, OnlyFans, BDSM, dominatrix. Essentially, sex work is any type of exchange of a sexual fantasy or sexual service in exchange for cash or for compensation. Who are sex workers? So that ties in a lot with what Cara was speaking about with intersectionality, because when you think about liberal feminism, a lot of times when you think about sex work, or formerly what we don't currently say prostitution, but what has been considered prostitution in the past, a lot of times we're looking at middle class white women who are living like this luxurious Julia Roberts style life. And that's a lot of times not necessarily the case. Sex workers typically are working class women. They're women of color. They're LGBT workers, LGBTQ workers, trans women, trans men, and other non-binary bodies, migrant workers, undocumented immigrants and refugees, disabled and non-traditional bodies, working class mothers, grandmothers, and caregivers of children or the elderly, older women, and domestic violence and substance abuse victims, as well as homeless or runaway youth. And why do people sell sex? Like, why would somebody go into sex work? Once again, a lot of times in Hollywood movies and film, you will hear narratives about, you know, people wanting to make a lot of money, or people coming from really tough like childhood backgrounds and family backgrounds. And while those cases do exist, it's never to minimize those narratives. People are trafficked. Human trafficking is a crime and it is a human rights violation. However, there's a lot of reasons why people go into sex work, and the biggest way to explain that is to simply get the resources that they need because they're facing poverty. So selling sex is considered a non-violent survival strategy. And if we were able to increase sex worker safety, we would also be able to decrease, if we were able to decrease poverty, we could increase sex worker safety. It's not so much about sex work being about sex, it's more so about it being about work in a world where there are little alternatives, especially for poor or working class, Black, brown, Indigenous, or trans women. If everybody had the resources, the better paying jobs, the affordable housing, the universal healthcare, if we lived in a society that had those sort of social safety nets and protections, less people would sell sex. However, we don't live in that world. And so because people feel a need to make money and provide for themselves through this industry, we have to, as socialists, understand what our responsibility is when we're talking about creating a labor rights movement to include people who sell sex. In addition, there is a lot of debate, even within our socialist circles, about abolition, police brutality, and what exactly that looks like for sex workers. And so decriminalization in its full form, not partial decriminalization, which is what we know to be the case in a lot of the Nordic countries, that's going to be the best option, or the only option for sex workers to really be protected from the police, because we know that whenever the police gets involved with sex workers, they are more likely to be prosecuted, they're more likely to have their money or their other material goods taken away from them, they're way more likely to be deported, and we don't want to put anybody in a situation where the hard work that they've done to make their money is now being taken away because they're interacting with the police. So to better explain this, we're going to play a quick YouTube video that kind of breaks down some examples of the full decriminalization model.
Okay. There we go.
Data continues to show a conclusive link between laws decriminalizing adult consensual sex work and a sharp reduction in violence and STIs. Experts agree, decriminalize sex work to improve public health. A 2018 Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health meta-analysis reviewed more than 130 studies conducted over 30 years and made the following critical findings. Policing around sex work is associated with increased sexual and physical violence at the hands of clients, third parties, and domestic partners. Sex workers who fear law enforcement are put at an increased risk of infection with HIV and other STIs, and are more likely to have condomless sex than those who don't fear law enforcement. Policing of sex workers, their clients, or venues disrupts sex workers' support networks, workplace safety, and risk reduction strategies. New Zealand passed the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, fully decriminalizing adult consensual sex work. According to a study conducted by the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, New Zealand eliminated trafficking in the sex industry. Rhode Island inadvertently decriminalized indoor prostitution in 1980 in an attempt to make anti-prostitution laws less discriminatory. In 2003, the loophole was widely publicized. Prostitution was recriminalized in 2009 in a failed effort to crack down on trafficking. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that during the 6-year window of widely known decriminalization, the number of reported rapes in Rhode Island decreased by 31%, and the statewide incidence of gonorrhea was reduced by 39%. Health and safety benefits of decriminalization are not observed under the entrapment model, also known as the Nordic model, which criminalizes clients, but not sex workers themselves. The Northern Ireland Department of Justice released a report in 2019 analyzing 3 years of criminalizing clients of sex workers. Key findings include there was no impact on supply or demand of sexual services, but there was an increase in violence and social stigma against sex workers. When clients are criminalized, sex workers are exposed to higher rates of antisocial and nuisance behavior and report higher levels of anxiety and unease, as well as increased stigmatization. Decriminalizing adult consensual sex work is informed, evidence-based public health policy. Learn more at decriminalizesex.org.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So just to kind of link all of that with what we do here at DSA and our anti-capitalist work, essentially understanding that sex workers are being oppressed under the same capitalist structure that oppresses domestic laborers, retail workers, fast food workers. leaving them with minimal rights, especially in the workplace. And so by decriminalizing sex work, we would be able to give workers more ability to speak up when they are being harassed, assaulted, or discriminated against in the workplace, and also to provide various legal protections for people that are willing to come forward and want to seek out treatment, whether that be STI treatment, looking for affordable housing and things like that. It also ties in really well with understanding women's work in general and how historically women's work has been devalued in the capitalist structure. So women's work includes things like having children, raising those children, performing domestic labor in the household, anything from even teaching to nursing, roles that have been traditionally devalued. Wages have gone down in a lot of cases, like having children and doing domestic labor in the home. There is no wage. And so putting a spotlight on women's work as being valuable and being worth pay. A couple of really great resources, which I'll drop in the chat when I'm done talking, done running my mouth, are the Revolting Prostitutes book by Molly Smith and Juno Mack, which formed the basis of a lot of our socialist feminist education series, which we did at LVDSA. So we can take a look at that book if y'all want. It's really great. It breaks down how sex work is influenced by migration and borders and white supremacy and racism. And then also Birth Strike by Jenny Brown, which we're currently reading, which goes more so into how women's work like child rearing and sex and domestic labor are historically devalued, and what we as socialist feminists and socialists in general can do to bring a spotlight on getting things like childcare and universal health care for women, trans women, women of color, so that we're able to create a safer and more prosperous society for all those groups. And then lastly, just going back to what Blanca and Cara said about liberal feminism, trans women, indigenous women are the most vulnerable, even within the sex work industry. And so making sure when we talk about sex work, we're not just talking about the highly paid call girls or escort workers, but also considering the people who are experiencing the most marginalization sort of by our society. So that's all I have to say. And I look forward to opening up for questions, I think, next.
Thank you. Before we have questions, can we have a Zoom round of applause for Blanca and Jalen? Thank you so much. We will now be we're now going to be doing questions. And if you have a question, please drop it in the chat, or you can DM Heather. If your question is for a specific panelist, please put their names so we know who it's for. Our first question is for all of the panelists. Tell us about a socialist feminism project you're working on in your chapter. Do either of the panelists want to answer that? Cara?
I can kind of answer this a little and also answer one of the questions that was in the chat earlier, kind of together. Sorry, I'm just looking, McDonough, I'm just trying to find it. I'm new to Soc Fem, and it seems that it's a remnant of a past org structure, but I was wondering if you could share any experiences if you have them. So right now, what our chapter is doing, we're doing an entire revamp of our whole chapter. So right now we have like 10 committees. We have a eco-socialism committee, an education committee, electoral, labor, Medicare for all, mutual aid, Palestine, racial justice, socialist feminists, and all the committees work kind of separately doing their own projects. So as Jalen mentioned, right, we've done like menstrual drives for period poverty. We're currently doing a reading group for the book Birth Strike. We do a lot of reading groups in Soc Fem. We usually try to tie them to a project we're working on. When we did sex work, we read Revolting Prostitutes. But what we decided as a chapter, which passed almost unanimously, was that this chapter, that what happens is the work gets really siloed. People are really burnt out, right? From having, all these different things. You want to go to 4 committees, but then now you're at like 7 meetings a week. So we passed new bylaws. They're about to go into effect next month, which will be basically what we're going to do is we don't have committees anymore. We're going to do priorities. So we vote on priorities. And so, you know, they have like a mutual aid priority. So in the mutual aid priority, when the resolution gets put up, it has to address certain things. It has to address racial justice. It has to address recruitment. It should have something like that, has a socialist feminist lens, things like that. So, you know, we're really kind of trying to focus where instead of something like racial justice being its own siloed area, you know, socialist feminist being its own siloed area. So anything that has to do with women at all, it's like, oh, well, that's their job. Anything that has to do with, you know, our Black comrades in the community, it's like, oh, well, that's racial justice, that's not us. And it's like, no, racism is everywhere, you know, women are everywhere. So it should be built into all the work we do. So that's where we're kind of transitioning for that, because it needs to become something that we don't necessarily silo off. I think that, and we're not getting rid of our socialist feminist group is so great that we're not getting rid of it. We're just keeping it as kind of a caucus so we can still do reading events and groups and stuff, because we like literally, it's probably my most functioning committee. It's great, everybody loves it. And so but we want to make sure that we're doing work that actually addresses all different things. You know, labor is built into everything because we are socialists. So it is intersectionality in practice, as Eric just said. All right, so that's my thing.
Thank you, Cara. That was wonderful. Blanca, would you like to speak next?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things to McDonough. This last part, have you experienced socialist feminism? So on a national level, let me just tell you, yes, sometimes it feels like some other working groups, it happens in like AfroSoc too. So if you're looking for like a woman of color to, I don't know, sometimes we end up getting tokenized without our comrades meaning to do it, but it just happens if you silo it off. But if you know not to, then you incorporate it from a very organic state. Like, for instance, translation is the biggest thing for me. So language justice is huge. It's a huge thing that I've worked on. I will continue to work on it. And I have just kept talking about it so much to every one of my committees that now our international committee is starting to translate things into Spanish or into, we had them translated into Cajun, we had some things translated into Arabic. So whatever our statements are going to, we want to include that from the very beginning. So if you know, I mean, it sounds like you know, McDonough, that it, you know, we should integrate everything. Everything should be, it's easier when you start from an intersectional point of view from the very beginning than if you like later on are like, oh, wait, hold on, got to have this diversity. And then you just act, you don't mean to do it. You know, I'm sorry about Julie, but you don't, I mean, sometimes you don't mean to do it, but it just happens. You have to acknowledge it and we can move on together. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question, and this is for anyone on the panel or multiple people. How do we prevent gender discrimination within DSA, especially in regards to organizing related tasks?
I can answer.
Yeah.
I think preventing gender-based discrimination really comes from making sure that we are actively recruiting and welcoming members of various genders or non-binary people, and really creating a space where they feel comfortable and creating a space where they feel heard. And that's why when we started our Socialist Feminist Committee, we literally prioritize women's voices. So if we're in a meeting and a male comrade wants to speak, but a woman or a trans person also wants to speak, we're going to prioritize that voice because this is the space that we have created specifically for those voices. That's not to say that we don't welcome men into the space or that we don't welcome the male perspective or the cisgender perspective, because we do. However, we just want to make sure that it's understood that we are trying to amplify marginalized voices, much in the same way that we're trying to amplify Indigenous voices, the voices of sex workers, the voices of people who have been in the foster care system. Like, traditionally, those voices have not been heard. And so making it a priority within the DSA chapter in general, even in our bigger chapter meetings, of allowing people who don't normally speak or who don't normally get to speak, giving them the opportunity to speak, and then also having a well-established grievance process where we are able to look at issues when they do arise and to resolve them rapidly, so that people feel comfortable bringing issues and conflicts to the forefront.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to answer that question before we move on to another one? Oh, Cara. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we talk about like the organizing work too, things like was brought up just a second ago, Jill brought up, right? Like who takes the minutes, right? Most secretaries of chapters are women. Most, I think that like that's very common to have like secretaries being a woman. Even like treasurer is usually like a woman. When we ask who can take notes in a meeting, it's a lot of the time that's put on women because like that's traditionally kind of women's work, right? The kind of administrative tasks. And in general too, like that's how some of the work gets done. In my chapter, honestly, like which is great, but it's the women that really kind of get stuff done. Like some of the men will even have ideas, some of them do like it's even in leadership or whatever, but they are not doing the bulk of the like administrative work and kind of stuff like that. And I think that the way you get around that is just being really open. We put a thing in the chat about like being uncomfortable, right? And it is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to call out your comrades, but sometimes you need to. I said this idea the other day. We were in a big group and I said this idea, and then my male co-chair, who I absolutely love, like literally just repeated the idea right, like word for word right after me, and everyone was silent and just looked at him because it was almost funny. Like it was funny, like how that just happened. They were like, "That's the most male thing I've ever seen like happen in practice," and like it's common, but you have to say that, like you have to say like, hey, like can any men maybe want to take notes, or can that, because it is like a woman's thing, can we do that kind of thing. In Socialist Feminist, as Jalen said, like we have kind of those built in, like who can be chair, who can take up space and who doesn't, because we want to make sure that those voices are centered. It is the men who often take up more space, just society, right? And the way it works is like men are used to taking up more space and talking more. My chapter was almost defunct, like not even real, like 2 years ago. And there were like 5 white men, like leading the chapter. There were like, I was like the second girl in the chapter. Like literally they would be like, get in this picture. I'd be like, no, thank you. And they're like, we need more girls. Like and then we changed our bylaws and we added like 4 girls to the executive committee at the same time. And like we started getting shit done, right? Like we started doing stuff and the guys didn't like it. They had been in leadership for years. But I think it's important to like say that to people too, say, or give administrative tasks when you're asking, give those tasks directly to people that don't normally do that. But we have to, we're not just like throwing all the work at like men, right? We're just trying to make it equal, right? And like this shared, work, which for us as socialists, we need to make sure that everybody in a meeting, everybody everywhere understands that being part of this organization means that you have to put something in it, right? You're not an ideas person. You're not saying, like, if you want to say something, you have to be ready to kind of do it. And so I think overly emphasizing that to your members and making sure they know that like being part of DSA, you're actually part of something and you have a job. So, or facilitating, when you're, instead of saying things like, who wants to do this, I can say, hey, Justin, will you do this research for me, or something like that, and asking someone one-on-one, making those direct asks. And you should be asking people that don't normally do stuff or aren't sure how to get involved, because that is the case in a lot. In ours, Tiffany, who's here, everyone just gives all the work to Tiffany because she does it so well, but we can't just rely on Tiffany to do all the work, right? That's not fair to her. So, it's our job to do leadership development. It's our job to, make those direct asks of people. Blanca just said leadership development. I mean, it's great. And you have to actually ask people and talk to them and do it kind of directly.
Thank you so much. I loved all of those answers. So we have another question, and I'm going to put it in the chat. How do we get people who don't identify as women interested in socialist feminism? This is for anyone, any panelist.
I'll start. I think we're all oppressed by the patriarchy, including non-men and men. I think all of us are oppressed by it. So I think just making sure that you are like detangling exactly where that person is, like where they're at, and making it a direct, this is how you could benefit from a more socialist feminist world is really important, I think, because there's just this stigma with the word feminism that is so bizarre, but patriarchy is what's doing that. And you know, there's just so many things I can think of, like all of these, so much stuff, like so much aggression, this toxic masculinity that nobody needs. Men don't even need it. So just making it a direct thing. US Americanism is so individualized, and sometimes you just have to go with that to get people out to come in and start viewing things as the collective.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for our Q&A? Okay, let me see. All right, well, we want to thank our panelists and everyone who came today. We want a special shout out to the Las Vegas and Northwest Arkansas DSA chapters. We appreciate you, and we appreciate everyone who came today. And we hope everyone has a wonderful day. Here's what's next for Akron DSA. And please, anyone who would like to stay on and just build connections, please feel free to do so. If not, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been great.
Thank you again for inviting us. I know all three of us were very excited to do this.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm also sorry I got really nervous at the beginning of this. Whenever I saw that question, I was like, wait, how do I describe this to this person? So I'm really sorry, got nervous, but I'll put my email in here if anybody wants to reach out. Happy to have a one-on-one with anyone.
We appreciate